Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of London to Ladysmith via Pretoria by Winston S. Churchill. Today, 125 years ago, the future Prime Minister reported from the fronts of the Boer War in South Africa. We shall follow his footsteps as he narrates his adventures himself. Subscribe to our channel so as not to miss anything. Chapter 20, The Combat of Vaal Krantz. General Buller's Headquarters, February 9, 1900.
During the 10 days that passed peacefully after the British retreat from the positions beyond Treechart's Drift, Sir Redvers Buller's force was strengthened by the arrival of a battery of horse artillery, 2 powerful siege guns, 2 squadrons of the 14th Hussars, and drafts for the infantry battalions, amounting to 2,400 men. Thus, not only was the loss of 1,600 men in the 5 days fighting round Spionkop made good, but the army was actually 1,000 stronger than before its repulse. Good and plentiful rations of meat and vegetables were given to the troops, and their spirits were restored by the general's public declaration that he had discovered the key to the enemy's position, and the promise that within a week from the beginning of the impending operation, Ladysmith should be relieved. The account of the straits to which the gallant garrison was now reduced by famine, disease, and war increased the earnest desire of officers and men to engage the enemy and, even at the greatest price, to break his lines. In spite of the various inexplicable features which the actions of Colenso and Spionkop presented, the confidence of the army in Sir Redvers Buller was still firm, and the knowledge that he himself would personally direct the operations, instead of leaving their conduct to a divisional commander, gave general satisfaction and relief. On the afternoon of February 4th, the superior officers were made acquainted with the outlines of the plan of action to be followed. The reader will perhaps remember the description in a former letter of the Boer position before Potgieter's and Treechart's Drift as a horizontal note of interrogation, of which Spionkop formed the center angle. The fighting of the previous week had been directed towards the straight line, and on the angle, the new operation was aimed at the curve. The general scheme was to seize the hills which formed the left of the enemy's position and roll him up from left to right. It was known that the Boers were massed mainly in their central camp behind Spionkop, and that, as no demonstration was intended against the position in front of Treechart's Drift, their whole force would be occupying the curve and guarding its right flank. The details of the plan were well conceived. The battle would begin by a demonstration against the Braakfontein position, which the Boers had fortified by 4 tiers of trenches, with bomb-proof casemates, barbed wire entanglements, and a line of redoubts, so that it was obviously too strong to be carried frontally. This demonstration would be made by Wynn's brigade, formerly Woodgate's, supported by 6 batteries of artillery, the howitzer battery, and the 2 4.7-inch naval guns. These troops crossed the river by the pontoon bridge at Potgieter's on the 3rd and 4th, relieving Littleton's brigade, which had been in occupation of the advanced position on the low kopjes. A new pontoon bridge was thrown at the angle of the river a mile below Potgieter's, the purpose of which seemed to be to enable the frontal attack to be fully supported. While the artillery preparation of the advance against Braakfontein and Wynn's advance were going on, Cleary's division, consisting of Hart's brigade and Hildyard's, and Littleton's brigade were to mass near the new pontoon bridge, number 2, as if about to support the frontal movement. When the bombardment had been in progress for 2 hours, these 3 brigades were to move, not towards the Braakfontein position, but eastwards to Munger's Drift, throw a pontoon bridge, covered first by 1 battery of field artillery withdrawn from the demonstration, secondly by the fire of guns which had been dragged to the summit of Swartkop, and which formed a powerful battery of 14 pieces, viz. 6 12-pounder long-range naval guns, 2 15-pounder guns of the 64th Field Battery, 6 9-pounder mountain guns, and lastly by the 2 50-pounder siege guns. As soon as the bridge was complete, Littleton's brigade would cross, and ignoring the fire from the Boer left, extended along the Doornkloof Heights, attack the Vaal Krantz Ridge, which formed the left of the horseshoe curve around the debouches of Potgieter's. This attack was to be covered on its right by the guns already specified on Swartkop and the 64th Field Battery, and prepared by the 6 artillery batteries employed in the demonstration, which were to withdraw one by one at intervals of 10 minutes, cross No. 2 pontoon bridge, and take up new positions opposite to the Vaal-Krantz Ridge. If and when Vaal-Krantz was captured, all 6 batteries were to move across No. 3 bridge and take up positions on the hill, whence they could prepare and support the further advance of Cleary's division, which, having crossed, was to move past Vaal-Krantz, pivot to the left on it, and attack the Brackfontein position from its left flank. The 1st Cavalry Brigade under Byrne Murdoch, Royals, 13th and 14th Hussars, and a battery RHA, would also cross and run the gauntlet of Doornkloof and break out onto the plateau beyond Clary's division. The 2nd Cavalry Brigade, South African Light Horse, Composite Regiment, Thornycrofts, and Bethune's Mounted Infantry, and the Colt Battery, were to guard the right and rear of the attacking troops from any attack coming from Doornkloof. Wynne was to cooperate as opportunity offered. Talbot Coke was to remain in reserve. Such was the plan, and it seemed to all who heard it good and clear. It gave scope to the whole force and seemed to offer all the conditions for a decisive trial of strength between the two armies. On Sunday afternoon, the infantry brigades began to move to their respective positions, and at daylight on the 5th, the cavalry division broke its camp behind Spearman's. At 7:09, the bombardment of the Brackfontein position began, and by 7:30, all the artillery except the Swartkop guns were firing in a leisurely fashion at the Boer redoubts and entrenchments. At the same time, Wynne's brigade moved forward in dispersed formation towards the enemy, and the cavalry began to defile across the front and to mass near the 3 infantry brigades collected near No. 2 pontoon bridge. For some time, the Boers made no reply, but at about 10 o'clock, their Vickers Maxim opened on the batteries firing from the Potgieter's Plain, and the fire gradually increased as other guns, some of great range, joined in, until the artillery was sharply engaged in an unsatisfactory duel. 50 guns exposed in the open against 6 or 7 guns concealed and impossible to find. The Boer shells struck all along the advanced batteries, bursting between the guns, throwing up huge fountains of dust and smoke, and covering the gunners at times completely from view. Shrapnel shells were also flung from both flanks and ripped the dusty plain with their scattering bullets. But the artillery stood to their work like men, and though they apparently produced no impression on the Boer guns, did not suffer as severely as might have been expected, losing no more than 15 officers and men altogether. At intervals of 10 minutes, the batteries withdrew in beautiful order and ceremony and defiled across the 2nd pontoon bridge. Meanwhile, Wynne's brigade had advanced to within 1,200 yards of the Brackfontein position and retired, drawing the enemy's heavy fire. The 3 brigades under Cleary had moved to the right near Munger's Drift. The cavalry were massed in the hollows at the foot of Swartkop, and the engineers had constructed the 3rd pontoon bridge, performing their business with excellent method and dispatch under a sharp fire from Boer skirmishers and a Maxim. The 6 batteries and the howitzers now took up positions opposite Vaal-Krantz, and 70 guns began to shell this ridge in regular preparation and to reply to 3 Boer guns which had now opened from Doornkloof and our extreme right. A loud and crashing cannonade developed. At midday, the Durham Light Infantry of Littleton's brigade crossed the 3rd pontoon bridge and advanced briskly along the opposite bank on the Vaal-Krantz Ridge. They were supported by the 3rd King's Royal Rifles, and behind these, the other 2 battalions of the brigade strengthened the attack. The troops moved across the open in fine style, paying no attention to the enemy's guns on Doornkloof, which burst their shrapnel at 7,000 yards, with remarkable accuracy. In an hour, the leading companies had reached the foot of the ridge, and the active riflemen could be seen clambering swiftly up. As the advance continued, one of the Boer Vickers Maxim guns, which was posted in rear of Vaal-Krantz, found it wise to retire and galloped off unscathed through a tremendous fire from our artillery, a most wonderful escape. The Durham Light Infantry carried the hill at the point of the bayonet, losing 7 officers and 60 or 70 men, and capturing 5 Boer prisoners, besides 10 horses and some wounded. Most of the enemy, however, had retired before the attack, unable to endure the appalling concentration of artillery which had prepared it. Among those who remained to fight to the last were 5 or 6 armed Kaffirs, one of whom shot an officer of the Durhams. To these, no quarter was given. Their employment by the Dutch in this war shows that while they furiously complain of Khama's defense of his territory against their raiding parties on the ground that white men must be killed by white men, they have themselves no such scruples. There is no possible doubt about the facts set forth above, and the incident should be carefully noted by the public. By nightfall, the whole of General Littleton's brigade had occupied Vaal Krantz and were entrenching themselves. The losses in the day's fighting were not severe, and though no detailed statement has yet been compiled, I do not think they exceeded 150. Part of Sir Redvers Buller's plan had been successfully executed. The fact that the action had not been opened until 7 a.m. and had been conducted in a most leisurely manner left the program only half completed. It remained to pass Cleary's division across the third bridge to plant the batteries in their new position on Vaal Krantz, to set free the 1st Cavalry Brigade in the plain beyond, and to begin the main attack on Brockfontein. It remained, and it still remains. During the night of the 5th, Littleton's brigade made shelters and traverses of stones and secured the possession of the hill, but it was now reported that field guns could not occupy the ridge because, first, it was too steep and rocky, though this condition does not apparently prevent the Boers dragging their heaviest guns to the tops of the highest hills, and secondly, because the enemy's long-range rifle fire was too heavy. The hill, therefore, which had been successfully captured, proved of no value whatever. Beyond it was a second position which was of great strength, and which, if it was ever to be taken, must be taken by the infantry without artillery support. This was considered impossible, or at any rate too costly and too dangerous to attempt. During the next day, the Boers continued to bombard the captured ridge, and also maintained a harassing long-range musketry fire. A great gun firing a 100-pound 6-inch shell came into action from the top of Doornkloof, throwing its huge projectiles on Vaal Krantz and about the bivouacs generally. One of them exploded within a few yards of Sir Redvers Buller. 2 Vickers Maxims from either side of the Boer position fired at brief intervals, and other guns burst shrapnel effectively from very long range on the solitary brigade which held Vaal Krantz. To this bombardment, the field artillery and the naval guns, 72 pieces in all, both big and little, made a noisy but futile response. The infantry of Littleton's brigade, however, endured patiently throughout the day, in spite of the galling crossfire and severe losses. At about 4 in the afternoon, the Boers made a sudden attack on the hill, creeping to within short range, and then opened a quick fire. The Vickers Maxim guns supported this vigorously. The pickets at the western end of the hill were driven back with loss, and for a few minutes it appeared that the hill would be retaken. But General Littleton ordered half a battalion of the Durham Light Infantry, supported by the King's Royal Rifles, to clear the hill, and these fine troops, led by Colonel Fitzgerald, rose up from their shelters and giving 3 rousing cheers, the thin, distant sound of which came back to the anxious, watching army, swept the Boers back at the point of the bayonet. Colonel Fitzgerald was, however, severely wounded. While these things were passing, a new pontoon bridge was being constructed at a bend of the Tugela immediately under the Vaal Krantz Ridge, and by 5 o'clock this was finished. Nothing else was done during the day, but at nightfall, Littleton's brigade was relieved by Hildyard's, which marched across the new pontoon, No. 4, under a desultory shell fire from an extreme range. Littleton's brigade returned under cover of darkness to a bivouac underneath the Zwartkop guns. Their losses in the 2 days' operations had been 225 officers and men. General Hildyard, with whom was Prince Christian Victor, spent the night in improving the defenses of the hill and in building new traverses and head cover. At midnight, the Boers made a fresh effort to regain the position, and the sudden roar of musketry awakened the sleeping army. The attack, however, was easily repulsed. At daybreak, the shelling began again, only now the Boers had brought up several new guns, and the bombardment was much heavier. Owing, however, to the excellent cover which had been arranged, the casualties during the day did not exceed 40. The cavalry and transport, who were sheltering in the hollows underneath Zwartkop, were also shelled, and it was thought desirable to move them back to a safer position. In the evening, Sir R.M.S. Buller, who throughout these 2 days had been sitting under a tree in a somewhat exposed position, and who had bivouacked with the troops, consulted with his generals. Many plans were suggested, but there was a general consensus of opinion that it was impossible to advance further along this line. At 11 at night, Hildyard's brigade was withdrawn from Vaal Krantz, evacuating the position in good order, and carrying with them their wounded, whom till dark it had been impossible to collect. Orders were issued for the general retirement of the army to Springfield and Spearman's, and by 10 o'clock on the 8th, this operation was in full progress. With feelings of bitter disappointment at not having been permitted to fight the matter out, the infantry, only 2 brigades of which had been sharply engaged, marched by various routes to their former camping grounds, and only their perfect discipline enabled them to control their grief and anger. The cavalry and artillery followed in due course, and thus the 4th attempt to relieve Ladysmith, which had been begun with such hopes and enthusiasm, fizzled out into failure. It must not, however, be imagined that the enemy conducted his defense without proportionate loss. What I have written is a plain record of facts, and I am so deeply conscious of their significance that I shall attempt some explanation. The Boer, covering army numbers at least 12,000 men, with perhaps a dozen excellent guns. They hold along the line of the Tugela what is practically a continuous position of vast strength. Their superior mobility, and the fact that they occupy the chord, while we must move along the arc of the circle, enables them to forefront us with nearly their whole force wherever an attack is aimed, however it may be disguised. Therefore, there is no way of avoiding a direct assault. Now, according to continental experience, the attacking force should outnumber the defense by 3 to 1. Therefore, Sir R.M.S. Buller should have 36,000 men. Instead of this, he has only 22,000. Moreover, behind the first row of positions, which practically runs along the edge of an unbroken line of steep, flat-topped hills, there is a second row standing back from the edge at no great distance. Any attack on this second row the artillery cannot support, because from the plain below they are too far off to find the Boer guns, and from the edge they are too close to the enemy's riflemen. The ground is too broken, in the opinion of many generals, for night operations. Therefore, the attacking infantry of insufficient strength must face unaided the fire of cool, entrenched riflemen, armed with magazine weapons and using smokeless powder. Nevertheless, so excellent is the quality of the infantry that if the whole force were launched in attack, it is not impossible that they would carry everything before them. But after this first victory, it will be necessary to push on and attack the Boers investing Ladysmith. The line of communications must be kept open behind the relieving army, or it will be itself in the most terrible danger. Already, the Boers' position beyond Potgieter's laps around us on 3 sides. What if we should break through, only to have the door shut behind us? At least 2 brigades would have to be left to hold the line of communications. The rest, weakened by several fierce and bloody engagements, would not be strong enough to effect the relief. The idea of setting all on the turn of the battle is very grateful and pleasant to the mind of the army, which only asks for a decisive trial of strength. But Sir R.M.S. Buller has to remember that his army, besides being the Ladysmith relief column, is also the only force which can be spared to protect South Natal. Is he, therefore, justified in running the greatest risks? On the other hand, how can we let Ladysmith and all its gallant defenders fall into the hands of the enemy? It is agonizing to contemplate such a conclusion to all the efforts and sacrifices that have been made. I believe and trust we shall try again. As long as there is fighting, one does not reflect on this horrible situation. I have tried to explain some of the difficulties which confront the general. I am not now concerned with the attempts that have been made to overcome them. A great deal is incomprehensible, but it may be safely said that if Sir Redvers Buller cannot relieve Ladysmith with his present force, we do not know of any other officer in the British service who would be likely to succeed.
This concludes today's reading of London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, by Winston S. Churchill. Join us also on February 15th for the subsequent chapter. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thanks for listening, and so long.